In the early 1800s, life for children born into slavery in the southern United States was harsh and unrelenting. From the moment they woke up before sunrise, their days were consumed by hard labor in the fields. Children, some as young as 5 or 6, were expected to help plant, weed, and harvest crops, often under the watchful eyes of overseers who showed little mercy. Families were separated, and children had to grow up quickly, learning the harsh realities of the world around them. There were no schools, no time to play, and very little hope for a life beyond the plantations. Every small task was a lesson in survival, every day a test of endurance. Despite these challenges, there were moments of quiet resilience. Children would share whispered stories, small acts of kindness, and fleeting moments of laughter among themselves. These small, simple acts created bonds of hope that allowed them to endure the overwhelming hardships of slavery. The world around them seemed determined to suppress their spirit, yet even in such oppressive conditions, children found ways to resist in subtle, quiet ways. Whether it was by slowing down a task to avoid punishment, helping a friend in secret, or learning to navigate the dangerous environment cleverly, they were quietly asserting their humanity. By understanding the life of these children, we begin to see not only the cruelty of the system, but also the strength and resilience of young lives forced into unimaginable circumstances. Their story is a reminder that even in the darkest times, the human spirit seeks freedom and dignity. By the 1820s, Louisiana's record-keeping was already decades old, but much of it was chaotic and poorly maintained. Parish clerks were responsible for documenting births, deaths, and other vital records, yet the system left room for mistakes, or in some cases deliberate manipulation. Gerald Hutchkins, a meticulous historian, stepped into St. Bernard Parish in 1893 to catalog the archives dating back to 1820. He noticed the unusual smell of vinegar mixed with rust as he entered the clerk's office. It was a sharp, almost sour scent that hinted at the age and condition of the documents inside. Gerald, a methodical man in his 30s, had a reputation for precision. He had organized parish records across the state and treated each document with care, as though the paper itself held a life worth preserving. On this humid morning, he began examining the shelves filled with old volumes and dust-covered boxes. Some boxes had never been opened in 40 years, and rumors of special documents only added to his curiosity. He started with the more accessible records, birth registrations from the 1870s, which were well organized and relatively intact. But when he reached a corner of the archive, he found a set of older, darker wooden boxes stacked to conceal what lay behind. These boxes were carefully hidden, almost as if someone had intentionally tried to erase their contents from history. Opening the first few boxes revealed routine plantation records, crop yields, equipment purchases, and weather observations. But the third box, sealed with hardened wax, contained 4 leather-bound ledgers with no markings on the covers. Gerald's hands trembled slightly as he carefully opened the first ledger. Inside, he found pages listing births from 1829 to 1834. At first, the entries seemed normal. Child's name, mother's name, father's name if known, plantation of origin, and the registrar's signature. But soon Gerald noticed a troubling pattern. Children born to enslaved mothers were often recorded as white. A female child named Marie, born in 1830 to a mother identified as Negro, was listed as white. A few pages later, a boy named Thomas, also born to an enslaved mother, was recorded the same way. Gerald realized this wasn't a clerical mistake. The same registrar, J. Armand, had signed every entry. Over several ledgers covering years, dozens of children were classified as white at birth despite being born to enslaved mothers. The implications were chilling. These records were not random errors. They were deliberate. Children born into slavery were being legally documented as white, potentially to alter their social and legal status. Gerald could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. Something systematic had been happening in St. Bernard Parish, something that would have lasting consequences for these children and their families. As Gerald Hutchkins continued his work, he realized the ledger entries were only the tip of the iceberg. The next box contained letters, written in faded ink, between plantation owners and parish officials. These letters revealed the reasoning behind the unusual record-keeping. One letter, dated June 1832, was addressed from a plantation owner named Etienne Duval to the parish registrar. Etienne wrote that several children born to enslaved mothers had been claimed by benevolent neighbors, or legally reclassified, to ensure they would have a chance at freedom or inheritance in the future. The language was formal, almost polite, but the underlying purpose was clear. There was an intentional manipulation of birth records to change the social status of certain children. Gerald paused to read the margins, where a clerk had scribbled notes in shorthand. The notes hinted at a system. Children with certain family connections, skills, or potential for influence were marked for reclassification. It was a practice not widely known outside the local community, and one that could easily be erased from history if someone destroyed the ledgers. As he examined more letters, Gerald noticed references to plantation economics. Some children were reclassified to protect property interests. If a child could one day inherit land, crops, or tools, their status as white rather than enslaved gave them legal leverage. This wasn't just an act of kindness or rebellion. It was a calculated decision shaped by both morality and economics. The human stories behind these records became more vivid. Gerald found notes about a young boy named Samuel, whose mother had pleaded for him to be legally recognized as free. Samuel's father, a white plantation worker, had secretly arranged for the parish registrar to list the child as white. The letter detailed Samuel's early schooling, the small allowance he received for clothes, and his mother's cautious hope that he would escape the brutal life of forced labor. Another story involved a girl named Elise, born to an enslaved mother, but raised under the watch of her grandmother, a skilled midwife. Elise had shown extraordinary intelligence in reading and arithmetic, skills uncommon for enslaved children who were rarely taught to read. The registrar had noted her abilities and ensured she was officially listed as white, giving her legal recognition that would protect her from being sold or forced into plantation labor. By the time Gerald finished the letters, he understood that St. Bernard Parish had developed a secret system, quietly influencing the lives of countless children. It was a system that balanced survival, opportunity, and hidden defiance against the rigid hierarchy of slavery. Yet the mystery remained. How many more of these children's stories were hidden in unexamined boxes, waiting to be uncovered? Gerald knew that for every ledger and letter he had seen, there were dozens more waiting, each with its own story of struggle, cunning, and hope. With the letters and ledgers revealing so much, Gerald turned his attention to the personal accounts tucked in the margins of the records. There were notes written by the parish clerks themselves, often in a mix of French and English, detailing observations of children, families, and the subtle ways in which society bent the rules to protect certain lives. One recurring theme was education. Many children who had been reclassified received basic literacy lessons, which was rare for the enslaved population at that time. The letters indicated that some plantation owners quietly supported these lessons, often citing practical reasons. A literate worker or child could handle trade records, manage inventory, or act as an intermediary in business transactions. But beneath the surface, there was a more human motive. These small acts of education were a quiet rebellion against the system of oppression. Gerald also discovered references to hidden networks within the parish. Families who had the knowledge, resources, or connections could intervene on behalf of children, ensuring that they were not lost to the brutal labor system. These networks were informal, often secretive, but their impact was profound. Children like Samuel and Elise were beneficiaries of such networks, receiving protection that would shape their entire lives. He read a particularly moving account of twins born to a mother enslaved on a distant plantation. The twins were separated at birth, but thanks to careful documentation and strategic interventions by neighbors and relatives, both were later reunited and officially recognized as free. The documents described their first encounter as teenagers, the mix of joy, relief, and disbelief, and the painstaking steps it took to reconcile the legal records. These stories highlighted the delicate balance between survival and resistance. For every child who was protected, there were likely others who were not so fortunate. Gerald realized that the ledgers and letters represented only a fraction of the human struggle hidden behind the official records of St. Bernard Parish. He also found evidence of subtle defiance against the legal system itself. Some entries mention children whose status was altered through forged signatures or misfiled documents. While these actions were risky, they demonstrated a quiet courage and a determination to challenge a system designed to control every aspect of life. As Gerald carefully cataloged the records, he began to see the full picture. This was not just a parish keeping track of births and deaths. It was a living, breathing record of human resilience. It documented how individuals, whether parents, clerks, neighbors, or teachers, found ways to bend the rules, protect the vulnerable, and create small pockets of hope in a harsh world. By the end of the day, Gerald felt the weight of responsibility. He understood that these records were not just historical documents. They were evidence of a hidden humanity, stories that demanded to be told. And he knew that every new box he opened could reveal another layer, another story of courage, strategy, and the quiet fight for freedom. The next morning, Gerald returned to the archive, his mind focused on uncovering the human stories hidden within the official records. He carefully opened a new set of ledgers, their pages yellowed and fragile, each line a record of births, sales, and transfers. Yet between the lines he could sense the lives of real people, children, parents, and caretakers, struggling to survive and resist. One entry immediately caught his eye. It detailed the case of a young girl named Margaret, born into a family of enslaved laborers, who was noted as exceptionally clever by the parish clerk. The clerk's note suggested that Margaret's intelligence was recognized, and yet, instead of being exploited for labor, she was secretly given access to reading lessons. The ledger mentioned a local schoolteacher who risked her position by providing instruction after hours, a quiet act of defiance in a world that sought to deny knowledge to those deemed unworthy. Margaret's story was not unique. Gerald found dozens of similar examples. Children whose lives were slightly altered by small acts of courage. A neighbor might shelter a child during particularly harsh work seasons, or a clerk might deliberately misrecord a birth date to protect a child from early labor. These acts were minor on the surface, but they represented a resistance to the systemic cruelty surrounding them. As Gerald sifted through the letters, he discovered correspondence between families spread across plantations. Some letters contained coded language, describing how to ensure a child's safety or how to navigate the legal system without drawing attention. It was a hidden network of communication, a community quietly fighting to preserve family bonds and protect the young. He came across a particularly poignant letter from a mother pleading for the release of her son, Benjamin, who had been promised as labor to a distant estate. The language was careful yet desperate, describing his talents, his good nature, and his importance to the community. Remarkably, the letter seemed to have worked. Subsequent entries in the ledger indicated that Benjamin remained on his original plantation, safe from the forced relocation. Gerald realized that the records reflected not only cruelty and injustice, but also the ingenuity and resilience of those oppressed. Even under extreme restrictions, individuals found ways to protect one another, to nurture hope, and to carve out moments of humanity. He paused at an entry about a boy named Thomas, whose father had died when he was very young. The records indicated that he was taken under the wing of an older family friend, who ensured that Thomas had access to food, shelter, and guidance. Years later, the ledger recorded Thomas as having attained literacy beyond expectations, a testament to the enduring impact of quiet mentorship and care. As the day wore on, Gerald reflected on how these small acts of courage accumulated over time, shaping the lives of the children recorded in the parish ledgers. Each entry was a piece of a larger story, one of resistance, survival, and human determination against a system designed to crush both. By the time he closed the final ledger for the day, Gerald understood that history was not only written in grand events and famous names. Sometimes it lived in the small, deliberate acts of kindness and defiance, hidden in the margins, quietly changing the course of lives. These were the stories he needed to preserve, to honor the resilience and bravery of those who had endured so much and yet found ways to keep hope alive. The following week, Gerald's research led him to the plantation maps stored in the old county office. These maps were not just diagrams of fields and buildings. They represented the intricate machinery of control and labor that had shaped generations. Each plot of land, each row of crops, and each building had a story of human toil behind it. Gerald studied the details carefully, noting the proximity of living quarters to work areas, the isolation of certain cottages, and the paths that children were forced to take daily. One map revealed a network of hidden paths connecting different parts of the estate. Gerald realized these were not accidental. They had been created by the enslaved themselves. Secret routes for messages, for small goods, or even for children to move safely without constant supervision. These paths were evidence of a subtle rebellion, a way of claiming agency in a life designed to remove it. While examining the map, Gerald came across a notation about an old oak tree near the river, marked as a meeting point. Intrigued, he followed this lead in the personal letters and journals he had collected. Multiple accounts referenced the tree, a place where families would gather in secret to share news, teach children stories and songs, and sometimes plan escapes or negotiate small freedoms. It was a sacred spot, a symbol of continuity and connection amid chaos. Among the letters, Gerald found one written by a man named Elijah, who described teaching his son about the stars under that very oak tree. He wrote about how he used the stars to explain navigation, timing, and hope. Even as his words were written in fear of discovery, there was a clear sense of pride and determination. The letter illustrated a profound truth. Knowledge was a form of resistance, and teaching it was an act of courage. Gerald also came across records of health and medicine. The enslaved people had developed their own remedies, passed down orally through generations. A ledger listed ingredients for herbal treatments, often using plants that grew wild along the riverbanks or in hidden patches of land. Gerald marveled at how these traditions preserved life in conditions where official medical care was denied. Each entry reflected both resourcefulness and a refusal to be entirely controlled by oppressive systems. In another journal, he read about a small school that had been hidden within a plantation barn. A courageous teacher, risking punishment, had provided basic literacy and arithmetic to children whose parents had begged for these lessons. The children described the classroom as a magical place, a world apart from their daily labors, where imagination and possibility were allowed to bloom. Gerald felt the weight of the courage it took to maintain such spaces, knowing that discovery could lead to harsh consequences for both teacher and students. The more Gerald explored, the more he understood that survival was never passive. Every act, teaching, sharing, hiding, or simply protecting a child from harm, was an assertion of humanity. It was resistance measured not in battles or headlines, but in the continuity of life, knowledge, and hope. By the end of the day, Gerald returned to his temporary quarters, carrying with him the maps, journals, and letters. Each item felt like a small window into the lives of people who had endured unimaginable hardships, but refused to surrender their dignity. He knew that these stories, once compiled and understood, would reveal not only the cruelty of the past but also the extraordinary resilience of those who lived through it. Gerald closed his eyes for a moment, imagining the children playing near the oak tree, learning in secret, and finding moments of joy despite the harshness surrounding them. He realized that history was not only about suffering, it was also about courage, creativity, and the unyielding human spirit that finds ways to survive and thrive, even in the darkest of times. The next morning, Gerald focused on the estate's financial ledgers, hoping to uncover more about the economic machinery that supported the plantation. At first glance, the numbers seemed dry: expenses, crop yields, profits. But as he dug deeper, the human cost behind each figure became evident. Every entry represented the work of countless enslaved individuals, their labor literally translating into profit for others, while they themselves remained under strict control. One ledger detailed the annual sugar production. The numbers were staggering, but Gerald's research revealed the hidden truth. These amounts were achieved through relentless toil, long hours under the sun, and grueling work that left bodies weakened and spirits strained. Injuries, illnesses, and exhaustion were not accounted for. Yet they were an unavoidable part of this system. Gerald made careful notes, realizing that the raw data, when read between the lines, told a story of suffering and endurance. He then examined payroll records for overseers and managers. The figures showed how the plantation incentivized strict control and punishment. Bonuses were sometimes given for efficiency in labor, which often meant harsher discipline for those who could not keep up with the work. Gerald shuddered at the cold, mechanical way human lives were reduced to metrics. Yet again, the resilience of those subjected to such systems stood out. Despite the oppression, families maintained traditions, shared stories, and found small ways to assert independence. Among the documents, Gerald discovered a set of coded letters between two enslaved women who had developed a secret system of communication to warn each other about potential punishments or to share news about hidden resources. The code was clever, using everyday phrases that would appear ordinary to overseers, yet carried urgent messages to those who knew how to read them. Gerald realized this was not merely survival, it was ingenuity and courage intertwined. One particular letter described a clandestine meeting where elders taught younger generations about herbal medicine, local geography, and family history. The gathering took place at twilight near a small creek, away from prying eyes. Gerald imagined the flickering light of small fires, the low hum of whispered instructions, and the sense of community that refused to be extinguished. These moments reflected a deliberate choice to pass on wisdom, despite the risks. Gerald also encountered references to music and song as tools of communication and resilience. Work songs, lullabies, and spirituals contained hidden messages, often serving multiple purposes: to coordinate tasks, to instill hope, and to preserve cultural memory. Gerald noted how melodies carried stories of ancestors, triumphs, losses, and aspirations, binding individuals together across generations. Music, in this context, became a weapon of survival, a subtle yet powerful form of resistance. By midday, Gerald shifted focus to personal diaries, which revealed more intimate glimpses into daily life. These accounts recorded small acts of kindness, shared meals, moments of laughter, and celebrations of birthdays and holidays. Even within the harsh confines of plantation life, these personal narratives highlighted resilience, familial bonds, and the human desire for dignity. Gerald understood that these ordinary moments were as important as acts of overt rebellion. They represented the persistence of humanity against overwhelming odds. In the late afternoon, Gerald revisited the old oak tree near the river. Standing beneath its sprawling branches, he reflected on all he had learned. The tree had witnessed generations of secret education, whispered plans, and shared wisdom. It had seen the courage of men, women, and children who refused to be erased. Gerald felt a profound connection to those who had come before him, a reminder that history is not only recorded in books but also in the land itself, in the hidden traces of life left behind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Gerald packed his notes and maps. The weight of the stories he had uncovered was immense, yet he felt a growing sense of purpose. The lives documented in these records were not abstract. They were real people who had endured hardship, fought to retain knowledge and culture, and passed on the torch of resilience to future generations. Gerald knew that his task was more than research. It was preservation, acknowledgement, and storytelling. He walked back to his quarters, imagining the lives unfolding decades earlier. The laughter of children, the guidance of elders, the careful transmission of knowledge under the shadows of oppression. Gerald realized that history was alive, not static. Every detail he recorded, every story he told, was a tribute to the strength of those who had come before, and a reminder that the human spirit, even in its most constrained circumstances, finds ways to shine. Gerald returned to the plantation archives the next morning. A new layer of complexity awaited him. He began studying the lives of those who enforced the plantation system, the overseers, the accountants, and even some sympathetic white workers. While the enslaved endured immense hardship, these people also operated under strict rules. Gerald realized that to understand the full story, he needed to consider both sides. Among the documents, Gerald discovered letters from an overseer named Thomas. At first, they seemed ordinary: reports on work output, complaints about disobedience, and notes about supplies. But as Gerald read further, he noticed something different. Thomas expressed frustration over the cruelty he witnessed. He admitted moments of guilt about punishments he carried out, and he even admired the intelligence and courage of some enslaved people. One entry described Clara teaching secretly. Thomas wrote, almost admiringly, about her ability to inspire others and maintain hope despite oppression. Gerald also examined hidden spaces used by enslaved people: the attics, underfloor compartments, and secret rooms. These were places for hiding belongings or taking temporary refuge. One ledger contained sketches of these spaces, showing tunnels and secret compartments. Gerald traced the drawings with his fingers, imagining the ingenuity required to create them without being discovered. These spaces were both practical and symbolic, proof of human creativity under extreme conditions. He read records of punishments and attempted escapes. One account detailed a group trying to flee at night. It described their planning, coordination, the risk of betrayal, and eventual capture. Gerald felt sadness at the outcome, but also deep respect for their courage. Even in failure, these attempts revealed the relentless desire for freedom. Another entry described a birthday celebration for a child named Samuel. Despite scarcity, families pooled what they had: a small loaf of bread, a scrap of cloth, and a few whispered blessings. Music, storytelling, and laughter filled the air. Gerald realized these moments were acts of preservation, ways to keep identity and culture alive. Even in chains, people found ways to express their humanity. He then read letters exchanged between enslaved people separated by sale or relocation. Smuggled notes carried love, warnings, advice, and hope. One mother wrote to her daughter, urging her to stay strong, to teach others, and to preserve knowledge. These letters served as bridges across impossible distances and lifelines for memory and culture. As Gerald read further, he noticed recurring themes: courage, ingenuity, resistance, and the pursuit of knowledge. Education was vital. Cultural practices were acts of defiance. Family bonds were survival strategies. Each document painted a picture of people refusing to be reduced to labor or numbers. Later, Gerald found accounts of religious gatherings. Despite the dangers, enslaved people secretly met for worship. They blended Christian teachings with African traditions. These gatherings offered hope, guidance, and a sense of community. Songs and rituals conveyed messages, warnings, and history in subtle ways. Finally, Gerald reflected on the contrast between public and private life. Publicly, enslaved people obeyed and worked under strict supervision. Privately, they nurtured dreams, shared wisdom, and preserved culture. This dual existence required constant vigilance and courage. Gerald understood that even small moments of autonomy were victories and symbols of true freedom. As the sun set, Gerald closed the archives. He felt deep respect for those whose lives were recorded, and for those whose stories were nearly lost. Each journal, letter, and hidden song revealed the resilience of ordinary people. In their lives, Gerald saw the enduring human spirit, a relentless drive to survive, resist, and hope, even in the darkest times. Gerald returned to the archives one final time, determined to piece together the last fragments of the story. This part of the plantation's history was often overlooked: the quiet moments of resistance and the strategies of survival. Every journal, letter, and sketch offered a glimpse into the lives of those who endured unimaginable hardship, yet refused to surrender their dignity. He discovered accounts of secret schools and literacy circles. Despite strict prohibitions, enslaved people taught one another to read and write. They passed down knowledge in whispers, through songs, and even coded messages. Gerald realized that literacy was not just education, it was power. Knowledge became a weapon, a shield, and a lifeline. Another set of documents revealed how communities formed strong networks to protect each other. Neighbors shared food, warned of approaching overseers, and helped one another during sickness or childbirth. These acts of care demonstrated resilience and ingenuity. Even under constant surveillance, bonds of trust and solidarity survived. Gerald read about the arts, songs, dances, and storytelling. Each performance contained layers of meaning. Songs disguised warnings and escape routes. Dances preserved cultural memory and offered moments of freedom, even if brief. Storytelling taught lessons, reinforced values, and maintained hope. In every act of creativity, Gerald saw resistance, expression, and identity. He also came across personal reflections from those enslaved. Some wrote about dreams of freedom, others about the pain of separation, and many about the hope they held for future generations. These writings were deeply human, raw, vulnerable, and resilient. Gerald felt privileged to witness these voices from the past, as they revealed strength beyond physical endurance. One final discovery stood out. a collection of farewell letters, written by people being sold or relocated. Each letter conveyed love, advice, and the determination to survive. Even in the face of uncertainty, hope endured. Gerald was struck by the recurring theme. No matter how oppressive the circumstances, the human spirit sought freedom, connection, and knowledge. Closing the archives, Gerald reflected on everything he had learned. The plantation was more than a place of labor. It was a stage of courage, resistance, and survival. Every small act, whether learning in secret, singing a coded song, or protecting a neighbor, was a statement of defiance. These ordinary people achieved extraordinary feats in the struggle for dignity and identity. As he left, Gerald understood the broader lesson. History is not only recorded in official documents and public accounts. It lives in the hidden stories, the quiet resistance, and the personal triumphs of those who faced oppression. By uncovering and preserving these stories, Gerald honored the lives of those who refused to be forgotten. The plantation's history was no longer just a story of suffering. It was a story of courage, ingenuity, hope, and the enduring power of the human spirit. Gerald knew that sharing this story could inspire others to recognize resilience and fight for justice in their own lives. And in that recognition, the voices of the past continued to echo, reminding everyone that even in the darkest times, hope and humanity endure.